Okay, so thank you for joining us. And can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, Catherine, will you
All
please
right.
introduce the first speaker?
Sure. So I first met Tom a couple weeks ago. So he was giving a talk with the Musconetnong Watershed Association. So he gave a really inspiring talk on planning and zoning. So I thought he'd be a natural fit to come speak with us tonight. So Tom, thank you once again for coming to speak with all of us. So Tom is a licensed professional planner, policy expert, university instructor, and nonprofit executive with over 3 decades of experience in the public, private, nonprofit, and academic sectors. He's been an independent consultant to nonprofit and philanthropic organizations, and an instructor at 2 major research universities. He's currently a part-time lecturer at the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University, where he teaches comprehensive planning and land use administration. Tom served as president, CEO, and publisher of Next City, which is a nonprofit organization that inspires social, economic, and environmental change in cities through journalism and events. Tom was a senior policy advisor to 2 governors, founded the Center for Resilient Design, and taught land use planning and infrastructure planning at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. He's a certified public manager, fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce, and an alumni member of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization. Tom serves as Vice President of Policy at the American Planning Association, New Jersey chapter, and was awarded the B. Blood, I might get this wrong, Shavusian Award for Outstanding Professional Planner. He received his Master of City and Regional Planning degree from Rutgers University, a Master of Arts from the Eagleton Institute of Politics. And oops, I skipped the slide. All right, so we are really happy to have Tom with us. So Tom, go ahead and begin when you're ready.
Catherine, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you all for your time. We'll just quickly move forward. I thought we'd talk a bit about how to engage planning and zoning boards. So on the next slide, you'll see in particular that we'd like to talk a bit about what's actually out there as far as understanding government. And some of you may remember Schoolhouse Rock, where they did the 3-ring government, looking at executive, legislative, and judicial rings going through. In the executive, in the case of local government, it's your mayor. In the legislative, it might be a township committee or a borough council. And on the judicial, it would be the courts. But as we move to the next slide, we also need to remember the 4th ring in particular, which is local boards. And so some of you may serve on planning and zoning boards of adjustment or land use boards, and we're guided by professionals, including engineers, attorneys, and planning consultants and planners. This 4th ring in particular is the area where I think we need to have folks more engaged. So as we move to the next slide, we think about in particular some facts about New Jersey. Most privately owned land is zoned for some form of development. Even though it may look vacant, there's some development capacity to that unless it's been permanently preserved. Unpreserved farmland and vacant lands have some development capacity. And oftentimes, we don't realize that just by looking at the land. Most approved development is consistent with existing zoning, or there are very minor requests for changes going through. And so that's why we need to pay attention to plans and to ordinances. If a town does have zoning ordinances, it should have a master plan. But in New Jersey, zoning does not have to be consistent with that plan. And I'll talk a bit about how that comes into play. So in the next slide in particular, you'll see one of my great philosophers, Yogi Berra, who said the future ain't what it used to be. And when we start thinking about the future going forward, we can't always rely upon what we've seen or done in the past. So on the next slide in particular, excuse me, you'll see that before 1900, most cities, towns, and villages developed organically. Several were planned according to the intent of the designer, and at times the designer was the king or the ruler of that area. It might have been an engineer or architect, there are actually communities where there are statues to designers, to developers, et cetera, or to a religious leader. You don't often see that today. And I think there are reasons for that. We used to have company towns and developers who would actually build in a common purpose and a common interest. And common sense ruled. So as we move to the next slide, in particular, we'll see that zoning is not planning. And in effect, we've really been doing over a century of zoning without really tying it to planning. We had city planning national conferences in the 1910s, but for the most part, they were all about controlling nuisances. And that's where zoning came in. In the 19-teens, 1920s, cities and towns started enacting different laws to basically regulate land use, height, area, bulk, and a lot of it had to do with public health. In 1926, the Supreme Court of the United States affirmed the validity of zoning as a police power, and it was done through the case of Euclid versus Ambler. It led to copycat Euclidean zoning in many cities, in many places. In fact, it's a standard joke that in the 1950s and 60s, towns used to basically hire engineers or planners to write ordinances or attorneys, and they would say, fill in the blank and put in that municipality. And some of the ordinances actually were adopted with the term fill in the blank. So that copycat ordinance led to single-use districts, but the intent was to minimize nuisances, prevent the loss of property values, and to protect property rights. In the next slide, you'll see the effect of all of that. Euclidean zoning, in effect, is a pyramid. And basically what it tried to do is separate residential from industrial. And there were other uses in between. So on the bottom of the chart on the left, you'll see heavy industry, and then it goes up to light industry, commercial, mixed use, multifamily housing, duplexes, townhouses, and then single family housing. And what was done in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s was to separate these uses in what we would call blob diagrams that you see on the right. You'd separate them because people were getting sick living next to places that polluted or had noxious fumes or different uses that people didn't want to live next to. In the next slide, you'll see the effect of all of that, which was in New Jersey, a lot of our planning is governed on the local level and our zoning on the local level, and the municipal land use law is the operating document. New Jersey statutes annotated 4055D-1 et sec. But in New Jersey, we also have other laws that affect how development takes place. We have County Planning Act, which actually requires that developments that happen on county roads and bridges or affect county drainage have to be reviewed by the county planning board. In certain parts of the state, and indeed in a majority of the state, we have regional planning. We have the New Jersey Highlands up in the area that I'm in northern New Jersey. We have the Meadowlands in northeastern New Jersey, the Pinelands in southern New Jersey, and the Coastal Area Facility Review Act, which is Department of Environmental Protection Review, as well as the DNR Canal Commission, the Delaware and Raritan Canal, where the commission actually has jurisdiction over lands nearby and development. We also have metropolitan planning organizations that for the most part distribute funds for transportation and other circulation improvements, but they do have jurisdiction. And then we have something called the Residential Site Improvement Standards, which requires that each town have some standard form of development regulations. That was enacted in the 90s, and towns have the option of deviating from that, but they have to pass an ordinance and seek approval from the state. And then last but not least, we have the State Planning Act, which was enacted in 1985 with the intent of not only getting state agencies to get their act together, but also to have a consistency among planning from the local all the way to the state level. And the complete guide to planning in New Jersey is published by the American Planning Association, is in my mind the Bible for what planning is all about in New Jersey. So if you're keenly interested in this topic, I would encourage you to go to njplanning.org and to pick up a copy of the complete guide. In the next slide, you'll see in particular, that the municipal land use law guides most development decisions, in particular on the local level. And the language directly from the Municipal Land Use Act said it's to guide appropriate use or development of all land in the state in a manner that will promote the public health, safety, morals, and general welfare. The MLUL regulates land use, including a comprehensive master plan, a capital improvement program, the official map, subdivision and site plan ordinances, zoning ordinances, development applications, and submission and review procedures. And the picture in the middle is the document, the MLUL, that's current, that's actually published by New Jersey planning officials, the organization that represents planning board and zoning board members. On the next slide, you'll see what are the requirements of a master plan. You'll note that a master plan is prepared and adopted by the local planning board. And there are two key elements to that, a statement of objectives and a land use element. Those are required. A housing element is also required, especially if you have a fair share plan or affordable housing obligation. The rest of the elements, for the most part, are optional, although there are certain requirements, most recently for resiliency, and also obviously to document the information through appendices. But towns can and should be enacting elements and a master plan that address everything from circulation to recreation to economic development to farmland preservation and green buildings. In the next slide, we'll talk a bit about the official map. So if you have a zoning ordinance, you really should have a master plan. If you don't, your zoning ordinance could be contested in court. So every town has a master plan. There's a requirement by the state that towns that have master plans at least re-examine them every 10 years. If the master plan is not re-examined once every 10 years, the zoning could be suspect and it could be litigated. An option for a town to do is an official map, which could complement the master plan and the ordinances and officially delineate the location of streets, drainage, flood control basins, and other public facilities. The official map is adopted by the governing body, but the planning board can help review that. So why would you want to have an official map? Well, it can officially designate, in particular, where streets and other public utilities will go. If you do that, then you better understand what development will happen. If a town doesn't designate an official map, then a developer or others could lay out their street network, their pipelines, et cetera, and it leaves further conversations and complications in the discussion. What's important to note is that local officials can't issue permits for buildings or structures that would encroach on the mapped streets and facilities. So if a town adopts official map and a developer comes in with a development plan that puts development on those mapped streets, local officials can't approve that. So it gives towns another, and public citizens, another way to engage and to provide predictability in development. It is important to note also, though, that zoning boards or the planning board, for some details, could direct the permit to be issued if a majority of the board finds that that land cannot yield a reasonable return to the owner unless a building is granted. So it is a very big hole, I understand, in the situation, but it at least provides the opportunity for dialogue and public engagement. A couple of the other items in the next slide that we'll talk a bit about are a capital improvement program. This is a situation where a town could plan for actual investments in the next 6 years. And it could actually help save money for the town, but also lead to predictability on what kind of development would happen. It was drafted by the planning board, but the governing body has to adopt that. And it could be amended by stating the reasons for doing so. This goes to the point of, where streets should be paved or fixed, where pipes should be fixed or put in place, et cetera. And again, it provides another level of predictability and certainty that could be critically important when you're reviewing development plans. On the next slide, we'll talk a bit about zoning ordinances. So this is what you tend to see most of the time, and what a lot of the discussion, in particular controversy, happens to be. And in many cases, towns will put their zoning ordinances on their website. And they'll have electronic versions, digital versions of that going through. But not many towns have their master plans on a website. So I'll get to a bit later about what you can do, but spoiler alert, I'll tell you right now, if your town doesn't have your master plan digitally on their website, that should be the first thing you should ask for. The zoning ordinance is adopted by the governing body, but the planning board has the opportunity to review or even propose changes. It's important to know that towns don't necessarily need to use zoning as a tool to control land uses, but most do. So recognize that. And most importantly, any zoning power not specifically granted to a town in the municipal land use law is reserved to the state. So although we like to think of New Jersey as a home rule state, the fact is if folks in Trenton, the state government, do not give the municipalities the right to do certain things, a town cannot do that. And if it's a specific zoning power that's not in the MLUL, a town cannot take that step. So I won't go through the details. This slideshow will be available to everybody afterwards. Go through, so consider that. For important considerations, it's important to note that the governing body must refer to the draft ordinance of the planning board for determination of consistency with the land use element and the housing element. So that's where those two items come in play. And the governing body may adopt an ordinance, a whole and part, inconsistent with the master plan if they have a majority of the authorized membership. So again, it's another huge hole in the situation, but at least provides you with the information. And if they make that decision, they have to do it in a public session. You have a right to comment and to provide your input on that. On the next slide, and I'll quickly go through this. As I mentioned, most development applications are consistent with zoning. There may be variances that are asked, and for the most part, it's a permission to depart from the literal requirements of a zoning ordinance. But the important thing to note is that developers are not entitled to variances because of personal hardships, only because of related to the land itself. And that's a very important consideration. There are three types of variances. It's basically two dealing with bulk and one dealing with use. And the D variance use is the most difficult to prove. And in many cases, regarding warehouses and others, it could very well be a D variance, a use variance change. On the next slide, we'll very quickly go through the fact that the town also has the opportunity to charge for improvements beyond the site of the development. It's called off-track or off-site improvements. And it could be situations where pipes, roads, etc. But there has to be a rational nexus, a connection to all of that. In the next slide, we'll talk a bit about plan development, and it could very well be an entire development. It could be commercial, it could be residential, and it could be a situation where it could be large opportunities for development. But you'll see in the next slide that for general development plan approvals, and oftentimes that's where they're looking for development greater than 100 acres or at least 150,000 square feet, non-residential area, or at least 100 dwelling units or 100 acres or less. The benefit is it provides it provides approval for up to 20 years. And for a developer that's seeking that type of assurance, a general development plan approval may very well be the avenue they may seek. So if you're looking at this as a citizen or as an elected appointed official, you need to think about it. If this approval is granted, that's locked in for 20 years. Changes happen. I mean, very few people predicted the pandemic. Very few predicted, 9/11. I mean, there are things that have happened that could potentially affect the Great Recession, et cetera, how development could happen. So this general development plan approval is something that needs to be considered very carefully. On the next slide, there is a process. And my point here is that you have a right and an important opportunity, and I would argue a responsibility to be engaged in the conversation. There's a completeness determination, there are escrow fees, there's a public notice that all has to be done. And if they're not done according to the law, that can be contested. And the development approval could very well be contested also. So it matters the dotting the i's and the crossing the t's matter. In the next slide, and I'm wrapping up, just quickly, these are the duties and powers of both the governing body and the planning board. And again, these slides will be available for you as you go through. The next slide goes through the duties and opportunities of a zoning board. And again, as a citizen, it's important to know what those duties and powers are. And in particular, for a planning or zoning board member, you should certainly know that. And then just quickly going through the last few slides, there are other actions and other actors that come into play, including advisory boards, historic preservation commissions, environmental commissions, architectural and design review boards, and the various governing bodies could have subcommittees. So they all could be opportunities for public engagement. And then lastly, just to show the final slides here, what can you do? Well, I think at the very least, consider these bullet points. Attend the various meetings, governing body, planning, zoning board, other public meetings. Review and comment on the annual budget. If you want to know what the policy is in your town, look to the budget. Review and comment on master plan ordinances, capital improvement programs, the official maps, site plans, development proposals. If these are not on your municipal website, they should be. Ask for them to be put on. You know, it's 2022. It's not that difficult to digitize these things. When providing public comment, you should supplement it with written statements and ask to be included in the official record. That will give you a standing in the discussion and potential opportunity to actually have standing if it ever gets to litigation. You should vote for officials who represent your interests and ask questions at these debates or other gatherings. And most importantly, volunteer wherever you can. If you can, run for office. As Robert Kennedy once said, the future is not completely beyond our control. It is the work of our hands. So I'll conclude with my favorite philosopher on the next slide. You'll see Yogi Berra reminds you, you can observe a lot just by watching. So watch, be engaged, and use your opportunity as a citizen to actually be engaged in the process. And thank you, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you, Tom, for that thorough presentation. So if anyone has any questions, please place them in the chat. But in the meantime, I have a question that I would like to ask Tom. So being that there are clear differences between the governing body, which a lot of times would be, I guess, town council or city council, the zoning board, and then also the planning board. When there's a situation where a particular municipality may not have updated their master plan, can you talk a little bit more about how that opens the municipality up for challenges and how that would potentially affect a developer wanting to come in to either make a variance to the zoning of a particular plot of land or to the master plan overall?
Sure. As I mentioned, the municipal land use law requires that if a municipality has a zoning ordinance, it needs to have a master plan. The master plan has to at least have a land use element, and I argue a housing element, as well as the statement of objectives. All of that needs to be reexamined at least once every 10 years. A reexamination report could be as simple as one line, it's fine, or it could be a brand new document, a brand new master plan, or anything in between. I would suggest that as people go to planning board meetings, they request that the master plan be discussed. Ask the question, not to put people on the spot, but just to basically ask them if they're engaged. When's the last time you read your master plan? And what does the master plan mean to you? And is there an opportunity possibly to revise the master plan? And the process could be something as simple as just holding a public meeting and having master plan copies available and asking folks for their comments and thoughts, to a full-blown analysis that includes capacity analysis, looking at what can the land actually hold for development. What about water? What about sewer? What about schools? What about road capacity, et cetera? A build-out analysis, looking actually at the zoning of a community. And right now we have the technology through computers very quickly to say if every parcel were built according to the current zoning, what would it look like? And more importantly, what impacts would it have? And you can start doing impacts on everything from taxes to roads, traffic congestion, to water quality, to the school system, et cetera. And then I would also argue there's an opportunity to look at the design of your communities and to bring us to a higher level so that we've got a calling to make sure we leave our places in a better place than we found today. I'm sitting in the River Resource Center, the Musconetcong Watershed Association, and outside we have a sign that indicates that human settlement's been in this area for over 13,000 years. We have artifacts that go back that far. We are just a speck in that history, and we have an obligation to leave the next generations better place than the way we found it.
Thank you, Tom. Would you have time just for one brief question, if that's okay?
Sure.
Okay. So this is a very good question. So the one question that someone has is, can you discuss how the redevelopment plans in particular, and spot zoning in particular? So I think the question is centered around redevelopment plans and the concept of spot zoning.
Sure. If I may, let me start with spot zoning, and that's clear, basically. The law is very clear about what municipalities can do regarding zoning. And if it's zoning just one specific lot, and it's a small lot, that's spot zoning, or a couple of lots, that's spot zoning. There needs to be a rational nexus, a clear connection between the land that's being zoned and the purpose going forward. And the purpose has to be very clear. And there's a very specific process that has to be gone through to rezone property. And again, the municipal land use law and succeeding amendments provide information on that. Redevelopment is something that's slightly separate from all that. There is actually a local redevelopment law. I did not make reference to that, but I do encourage you to take a look at that. It replaced what was called blight in previous generations, and it purposely used the term redevelopment rather than blight, because in some cases, it may not necessarily look or function like it's totally disused or it's not productive going through. It may be underproductive going through. There are very specific guidelines on how to determine whether an area is in need of redevelopment or rehabilitation. The law covers both of those, and there are some details on that. An area in need of rehabilitation is a less extensive review and will not allow anyone or a municipality to use eminent domain or condemnation. An area of need of redevelopment, you could use eminent domain condemnation, but it's not required. Why would a town go through something like that? Well, in some cases, it actually can provide a better result. If the zoning in place is unworkable, if the property is totally beyond what should be a usable state, if it goes well beyond the desires of the town going through, and if there's an opportunity to create a more beneficial economic development, environmental sustainability, social cohesion, all the different goals of the municipal land use law, the redevelopment law and redevelopment plan give the opportunity to first assess the properties. There has to be a picture of every specific lot and a detailed discussion about whether it's actually in need of redevelopment or not. And then a recommendation on how to go about doing that. The governing body has to approve that, and the governing body could then create an entity, either the planning board or a separate entity, to actually go and encourage redevelopment. A redevelopment plan could then be developed, which could go into great detail, not only about all the items I mentioned, but also include design, include function, include all sorts of different opportunities that could in effect be rezoning or creating an overlay zone for that. And the last thing, most importantly, is the redevelopment opportunity could give the town the opportunity to actually bid out a request for qualifications to see if developers are qualified to redevelop the property. And then a request for proposal to actually see if if developers actually have ideas. And it's through that request for qualification and request for proposals that I believe you get a better product, because you actually get people thinking about what's the future rather than just plopping down your standard box development.
Thank you, Tom. So we have several more questions in the chat. Tom, thank you very much for taking the opportunity to give a thorough explanation of both zoning and planning and how that corresponds with local town councils. We really appreciate that. If anyone has any other questions, please continue to place your questions in the chat. We will continue the Q&A after Lee Clark completes his presentation. Thank you very much, Tom.
James, just to remind folks, if they'd like, this is my card. Feel free to email me or call us at the Musconetcong Watershed Association. We're keenly interested again in helping citizens be more engaged in their activities and making sure that we leave place better for future generations. Thanks again to the League for all you do.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, moving right along. So next slide, please. Okay, so we have Councilman Lee Clark with us today. He will be talking about, as a council member, talking about what it's like from the perspective of a council member engaging with local community members and residents around a host of different topics. And we'll be able to provide insight in the minds of what elected public officials are thinking when it comes to any given issue, particularly warehouse sprawl. So just a little bit about Lee. So Lee Clark is currently serving on Phillipsburg Town Council. Lee also works at the New Jersey Future, where he's responsible for growing and managing the local assistant impact area and collaborating with the Funding Navigator program. His main focuses are engaging New Jersey's under-resourced water utilities servicing overburdened communities, working with municipal officials and stakeholders, and managing an agreement, negotiations, and closings. Prior to joining New Jersey Future, Lee worked in the Green Acres program at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, handling land acquisition and project contracts on behalf of the state of New Jersey. Prior to entering state government, Lee worked at the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters. That's an interesting place to work, managing their environmental justice policy agenda, conducting municipal outreach and stormwater advocacy. A local elected official, Lee holds a bachelor's degree in political science, concentrating in political communications, and a master's degree in business communications from Rider University. Lee also holds a certificate in board leadership and governance through diverse force program for the University of Pennsylvania. Lee, are you there?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. I'm sorry I have to keep my video off. Unfortunately, my internet's not doing that great. So if I turn the video on, you might lose me forever. So I just want to thank y'all for the opportunity to talk. And I just want to welcome everyone and thank y'all for coming out. I especially want to give a shout out to those from Warren County and Phillipsburg, because I see a couple of y'all are here tonight. So I'm very excited to present on the municipal perspective of warehouses and kind of share my background. Many folks who know me know that I started out as an environmental organizer, and I made my way into elected office just because simply I didn't like what I was seeing. And I've been looking to champion environmental issues ever since entering elected office. And I have no problem sharing more about my record on that as we go forward. But yeah, I'm ready to move on if y'all are. So as we get into the subject of warehouse sprawl, I want to take some time to explain exactly why the problem is so terrible in our nation and why New Jersey specifically is experiencing such a terrible go with warehouse sprawl. So as we know, with the rise of e-commerce, especially like organizations or businesses, I should say, such as Amazon, we're seeing an increase in the need for warehouses across the nation. During the years of COVID, we saw this spike. We saw many brick and mortar businesses really go out of the way and switch to e-commerce businesses just because the demand was no longer there. And as we're seeing developments in the internet and the development of monetizing the incentives of internet businesses, we're seeing a sprawl of warehouse need come throughout the nation, essentially. So that's essentially explaining why we're seeing this jump. But what makes New Jersey so targeted for this? What leads us to be a main focus of this? Well, a number of reasons. First thing is we're considered a travel hub, right? So we're uniquely placed right between New York City and Philadelphia. So we're a travel hub between these two major cities. We have a bunch of 18-wheelers coming through our states, much of which aren't even from New Jersey. So we're getting the emissions from out of state areas, right? So because of this, it makes New Jersey a very unique opportunity for developers to put their warehouses to store goods for businesses right in New Jersey to make it as short a trip as possible. Also, because of our location right next to as a coastal state, we have access to ports, which also makes us a unique opportunity for developers to put warehouses in our state, because once again, you go from the ship to the port to truck to warehouse for storing goods and for distribution purposes. So from a logistical standpoint, you're seeing that New Jersey is really getting the short end of the stick here, mostly because of our location here in the United States. But unfortunately, New Jersey was never developed to handle this kind of push from warehouse sprawl, and it just kind of jumped out of nowhere as we saw the rise in e-commerce happen. So when you look at it from that perspective, New Jersey and local zoning boards and planning boards have to update their master plans to take this into account. And unfortunately, many municipalities have not updated their master plans to take this into account. So as we go to the next slide, we now talk about location of warehouses. So when many people outside of New Jersey think of New Jersey, they think of industry, urbanization, sidewalks, pavement everywhere. But actually, if you look at New Jersey as a whole, we have an immense amount of open space, farmland, green space. And as someone who worked at Green Acres, I can tell you that New Jersey actually has the second most amount of green space in ratio to our population in the nation, only behind Alaska. So we actually have a lot of green, pristine areas. So when we're seeing this, our urban spaces in New Jersey are experiencing near capacity build out. So we're thinking of areas like Newark, Camden, Elizabeth, Jersey City. The usual places where warehouses historically have gone are experiencing build out. They're running out of space. So now developers are looking to turn to the more rural and suburban areas. And now these are becoming targets of warehouse sprawl. Now, as you can only imagine, and many people on this webinar are experiencing firsthand, we're seeing more and more warehouses pop up. In Warren County, I can tell you right now, is one of the targets of warehouse sprawl. Locally on Phillipsburg, we were facing warehouse ordinance as well. And I voted against the warehouse ordinance because it was not the right place for a warehouse. It was too close to the Delaware River. It was being placed smack dab in our downtown in a low income area. I ended up voting against the ordinance. Unfortunately, I was in the minority of that vote. But it struck my environmental organizer nerve, where I just couldn't support it in the end. And it just wasn't a right fit in my belief for Phillipsburg's overall development or health. And this is what we're seeing across the nation, across New Jersey. And as you look into the chat, I'm sure that folks are sharing their stories about how warehouse sprawl is creeping into their neighborhoods. So with that, we can go to the next slide. Now, as we're talking about the locations of where these warehouses are popping up, we also have to understand the impacts of warehouse sprawl, right? With warehouse sprawl with warehouses being put in the wrong locations, we experience a degradation of farmlands, removal of open and recreational spaces, truck emissions, degradation of our roads and bridges infrastructure that trucks were never meant to be on. Again, as a representative in Phillipsburg and living in Warren County, folks will tell you firsthand that the roads in our county, many of the roads in many of the more rural areas, were never designed to handle this much traffic, 18-wheelers going up and down these roads. They were just never designed for that. So again, this is another example of how many municipalities, either on the local or the county level, were left unprepared by this sprawl that just popped out, right? With degradation of farmlands, New Jersey is known for our blueberry and cranberries, correct? We export so many of them, but we're seeing more and more farmland lost to sprawl. And many farmlands many farmers are experiencing financial hardships, right? Because they're finding it harder and harder to compete in a global market. So you see a lot of developers taking advantage of that, offering them these huge financial deals for their land. So it's making it harder for them to compete in these areas. And so we're losing our competitive edge in farmland production for organic foods as well. And once again, we're seeing it all over the place. Removal of open and recreational space. This is one of the things that hits me hard in my center, because this is where we're talking about youth development. This is where we're talking about the health of our residents. Open space and recreation. When COVID started, right, we saw a huge influx of people going to state and local parks because we weren't able to go to local businesses. We weren't able to hang out with one another because of space, spacing that we had to enforce. Social distancing. There we go. That's the word I was looking for. So many people found solace in going to state parks and hiking. And this actually opened up the gate for so many people who have not normally been outside or outdoors to finally experience the outdoors and what nature has to offer. And it offers so many health benefits, both physically and mentally, to be in a clean atmosphere. And that's really hard to appreciate or to benefit from when you have warehouses either scooping up these lands or being built right next to these trails. So that's also something that we have to take into account when we're talking with our local officials. And then truck emissions. Now, folks may be interested in or knowledgeable of the EJ law that passed a few years ago. Unfortunately, warehouses weren't added as one of these elements that should be limited because they don't have air emission standards, correct? But one can argue that all the trucks that they do release air emissions into the air that poison neighborhoods where these warehouses are being placed. And historically, we see that these warehouses are being placed in the most low-income communities and communities of color. These are the folks that are pretty much taking the blunt of all of this. So truck emissions are growing in these areas across our states as well that we have to take into account. And these are also leading to health adverse effects, such as heart disease, cardiovascular disease, respiratory diseases that we also have to keep in mind. And then, as I stated before, our infrastructure was just never built for this, especially in the more rural areas. So with that, I'd like to advance to the next slide of talking more about the municipal level itself. Now, Tom went into great detail about this. And I'm so happy that he went into more technical aspects of it. But New Jersey is known as a home rule state. Now, as discussed, the MLUL gives municipalities the power to create their own zoning and planning ordinances. They control the development when developers want to come in and bring in new businesses or sorts like that. Now, because of this, municipalities hold a lot of power, a lot of control, either on the council level or on the lower level with our planning and zoning boards. So we see a balancing act here with many elected officials, right? Trying to choose between bringing in ratables or trying to strategically bring on strategic development for the community. There tends to be a lot of pressure for elected officials to bring in new ratables for a town, because the more ratables you can bring in, the lower you can keep the taxes, especially during a time right now where we're experiencing historically high inflation rates. We're still trying to recover from COVID, and you see a lot of municipal budgets trying to balance themselves out and try to keep taxes as low as possible for residents. So this is one of the arguments or balancing acts that elected officials on the municipal level are trying to wrestle with, right? And you also have to choose, like, if this is a development, a warehouse or another negative impacting development, what are going to be the effects on the people? Because we hear all the time, it'll bring jobs, but can you truly measure how many jobs will be coming from this development? Because as we know with warehouses, these are hard jobs physically, right? And many of them are turning more technological, right? So you don't have the same kind of warehouse jobs as you did like back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. It's just not the same anymore. And then you also have to see, are most of these jobs going to the local residents, or most of these jobs coming or going to out-of-staters or out-of-towners? So these are all the things that we have to wrestle with or scale in our head, right? When we're discussing ratables, and how are we going to keep taxes low? How are we going to gear development forward or redevelopment for a town So home rule can have a huge effect here. And this is going to go into one of the other slides I'll be discussing later on some possible solutions that I think we can help taper the issue. So if we go to the next slide. So as we were saying, chasing ratables. Ratables equal high value taxable properties. Commercial properties generate more revenue for municipalities, while residential development creates more expense, it can be argued, right? This tends to be the kind of projects a lot of municipalities tend to try to go for, because with your residential developments, and this excludes senior citizen development housing, I'll explain that in a second, there tend to be expenses with it. We always want to provide enough housing for our residents, but there also comes an expense with that with families, right? Because with more families moving into a town, then that goes onto a burn for the school tax. And then that's more of an expense on the town as well right there, because now you're introducing more children into the school system. Whereas with commercial properties, well, you don't have to worry about that problem, right? There are no families living in an office building. Also, these are properties that are creating jobs and revenue for a town as well. So these tend to theoretically be the kind of developments that you see towns going for. Unfortunately, warehouses fall underneath that category. So you have to have a realistic discussion with yourself. You know, are the ratables worth it? Or depending on the kind of plan that you're working on, is this a pilot that's going to be in the benefit of the town or the people? Anything like that. So this is what goes on in the mind of an elected official. And as a former, well, I like to think of myself currently as an organizer too, you have to wrestle with these. And then municipalities want large non-residential projects as a strategic to keep property taxes low, as I explained before. So we're always looking to develop and redevelop our towns. We want to increase the quality of life for our citizens, and we want to keep taxes as low as possible. But again, you have to have that discussion with yourself of balancing development with the good of the community, because not all development is good for the community and vice versa, right? So with that, we can move to the next slide. So clear need, right? I'm not going to say that all warehouses are bad, right? Warehouses are a need in our society, as I explained before, because with the increase in e-commerce, right? Warehouses are needed to store goods so they can be sold, transported, and that sort. But the real argument here is where we're putting these warehouses, right? Location matters. Warehouses should never be placed in the middle of a community, especially a low-income community that can't fight back legally. Warehouses shouldn't be placed next to parks or local roads, right? We always strive to want to keep warehouses away from densely populated areas. We want to keep them in areas near the highway. So as soon as trucks are coming out, they're not going through a local community. They're not poisoning the air of local communities, right? They're just going straight onto the highway. And we also want to try to utilize areas of that can benefit, right? So brownfields that can't be redeveloped or redeemed tend to be better areas for reuse for warehouses because the soil is already contaminated. And if the price is too much to remediate it, well, then we can reuse the land for those purposes. And we've seen other municipalities do that, but we also have to make sure that we're not putting the warehouse in a sensitive area that can affect, let's say, the local wildlife, the local people, the local infrastructure. So it takes a strategic look at where we're putting these places, or sorry, these projects. And also, we shouldn't be looking for undeveloped lands. So again, our farmland should not be on the table here. Our open spaces should not be on the table here that are already clean, that are being prosperous or at least being used for something. So let's go to the next slide. It brings us to public engagement. Now, I'm always a fan of getting public engagement here. And I can tell you, when we're dealing with the warehouse issue in town, my phone was going off the hook, all right, with concerned citizens. My emails were being flooded. Whenever I would walk on the street, I would talk to people, not only my neighbors, but everyone, especially in the downtown, to get their input on what do you think about this warehouse? But I believe that we need to go further than that. We need to have community input in the first stages of when a developer brings this up. And ideally, I believe this looks like a conversation that involves both the developer, the citizens, the council folks, the elected folks, and then also the members of the zoning and/or planning board as well. Because we need to produce not just development that we believe will push the town forward, but that the people of the town want to see. We need to be filling in needs. For one thing right now, I can speak of Phillipsburg. We're looking to get a grocery store. And that is a need that many people in my town have addressed to me that we need. We don't need another warehouse. We need a grocery store. And we work together to bring in a grocery store. And we got it all through approval. And we're working with folks to get that dream into a reality, and to bring in more opportunities like that. But it has to be a collaborative process. So the developer has to be willing to come to meet with the folks of the town, right? I believe that they should be open-minded about what the citizens of the town want to see in their community, because we can't just bulldoze what we want to see, right? We were elected to serve the people. And anytime that I can, I try to get input where I can from folks, because I serve at the privilege of the people. And I take great pride in that. But it's also a privilege to know that, you know, I could easily be replaced during election year, and I am perfectly fine with that. But I try to do my best to serve the folks that elected me. So we need to bring all stakeholders to the table, and not towards the middle or the end, but in the beginning. And that can be a very hard thing to do, especially with these bigger projects, because you have a lot of people who want to push things forward as quickly as they can. But if I can do anything, I always love to have people come and provide input at the very least at our meetings. So engagement is necessary for this process and should always be taken seriously, in my belief. So we can head to the next slide. This also brings me to mixed land use, right? New Jersey, as y'all know, is the densest populated state in this nation. We have over 9 million residents in the state and not enough land. So mixed land use can accomplish multiple things, right? Rather than going to undeveloped lands, we should be utilizing abandoned properties or uplifting properties that aren't fulfilling their full potential. So this is a way we can save on space, especially in our areas, our more urban areas, right? That are almost built out to capacity. But how many times do you go to these areas and you see so many abandoned buildings not being utilized? So many municipalities are facing limited space for new developments when we have an opportunity to have smarter growth here to revamp and redevelop formerly used places. This way we don't have to spread ourselves to undeveloped farmlands, right? Sorry, undeveloped open spaces or farmlands. Municipalities also need new development projects. So we always have to keep ourselves modern. We have to keep ourselves competitive, especially for towns like Phillipsburg that are right across the river from Pennsylvania that have lower land costs. We have to stay competitive. And I believe by bringing in new projects and new development, we can do that. So for states like New Jersey, utilizing mixed land uses and incorporating more of it into local master plans, I believe is key to smarter redevelopments and can actually preserve more of our open space, protect more of our farmlands, and have us be smarter where we're putting these developments. So we're not putting them in the wrong places. And then we can move on to the next slide. So as I was discussing before, we need to be looking at smarter solutions as well. Now, guidelines from New Jersey State Planning Commission released a set of guidelines for municipalities back in 2022 regarding warehouse sprawl. Now, this came as more residents were complaining about warehouse sprawl coming into the rural and suburban areas. But the problem with these guidelines are they're completely voluntary, right? You don't see a lot of municipalities utilizing these guidelines. And so as a fact, many of their master plans still remain not updated, out of date. And you still see municipalities making these individual choices without really taking into effect the effects that they have regionally or on their neighbors, correct? So you have organizations like New Jersey Future that have worked on these guidelines, also working with the state's planning commission to recommend a more balanced set of regulations and guidance. There needs to be some sort of regional oversight of this, but there needs to be a balance where we're not taking power away from the municipalities, because at the end of the day, who knows best for their communities than the communities themselves? But there should be some sort of steering wheel for municipalities to kind of say, hey, this doesn't quite look right, or this could be done better. those kind of recommendations offered on a regional level, kind of looking at what's being done on the municipal level. So I believe this is what we need to achieve to kind of curb warehouse sprawl. By achieving this, like I said, we can come out with smarter infrastructure, smarter development ideas, and also just prepare New Jersey for the next 100 years, because it also opens us up to more sustainable infrastructure. Because with the effects of climate change as well, our infrastructure being one of the oldest in the nation. I mean, we have water pipes literally from the 1800s that are still serving municipalities today. This here is an opportunity for us to adopt smarter, more strategic planning initiatives for municipalities, and also would allow municipal officials to be held more accountable to their residents as well, because you're no longer doing that balancing act in our heads, right? Because we're thinking, how can the two, development and the people, go together rather than being two separate entities? So that's my approach to how we should be addressing warehouse sprawl. And quite honestly, we know we need to reel it back. There's a need for warehouses, but there's a smarter way to develop them that does not affect our neighborhoods in such a negative way. So with that, I believe that's my last slide. I'm happy to take any questions, but I want to thank y'all for coming out and taking the time on a Thursday evening to listen more to such an important issue.
Thank you, Councilman Clark, for that presentation. That was, that was very insightful, very enlightening, and very enthusiastic. And we really appreciate that presentation. So I'm going to go into, if anyone has any questions, if you could please place your questions for Councilman Clark into the chat, and then we will go through them and answer several of, as many questions as possible. Right now we're at 7:03. We have till around 7:15, maybe seven. Councilman Clark, how long are you okay with several questions? Just making sure.
Yes.
Okay. So let me just look at this real quick. So what can be done when the planning board says, when the planning board says no to a development, but eventually says yes because they're more worried about being sued from a developer and being concerned about the citizens or the community itself?
So that's a very good question. And that is a major issue that elected officials do face, the threat of lawsuits. I think one thing we can do, and this is why it's so important to upgrade our master plans on the municipal level, because many developers are only able to do this because they have the outdated master plan, right? That says, well, I can build here because it's zoned for this kind of project. So this is a perfect example why we need to put, not pressure, but have these discussions with our planning boards on the importance of updating our master plans to update our zoning. Because now we see the sprawl happening and it's exploding. I wish I had a better answer on how we could address the fact that they say no and then switch their vote to a yes, because in many cases, then it goes up to like the council for final approval, in which case then I say, talk to the next body that's responsible for approving the development and have that conversation with them, because no one wants a lawsuit for the municipality, obviously. And many lawsuits can last years. I know one warehouse in White Township that's going through major lawsuits right now. And it's very costly and it takes a lot of time. But I believe this is where the people in engagement comes into hand, organizing, letting folks know, the developers and the elected officials, that this is not something you want in your community. Because the question then comes down to, who are your elected officials accountable to? These developers or the folks that vote them into office? And that's what, like I said, being an elected official is a privilege. And this is why it's so important to hold us, and I say us because I'm included in that, accountable. So if you don't like our actions, vote us out. But at the planning stage, just let them know that it's not an easy choice, but you need to let them know where you stand on the issue. I hope that answers your question.
It does. It does. Thank you. So next question. So I think that this question is more centered around, you'd mentioned this before, like planning and like keeping, municipal property taxes low for residents. So thinking about it now and in terms of ratables for suburban communities in New Jersey, what's a better option to bring ratables for municipality in 2023? And I think that Councilman Clark, you're in a little bit, I want to say a little more, not quite urban, but a hybrid of suburban and urban, I'm assuming. And taking into consideration that rates, taxes for residents is all, a lot of times on the minds of elected officials locally. What do you see as the possible opportunities for towns, for suburban towns in particular, to be able to tackle that?
Oh, that's a great question. This is where mixed land use comes in, right? This is how you can bring in positive, affecting, rateable projects. First, I would say figure out what your town needs. In Phillipsburg's case, what we needed badly was a grocery store. So we worked with the mayor and the majority of council to bring in a developer that was focused on senior citizen living. So it's a number of apartments for senior citizens. So once again, this is a residential development where we have new people coming in, but they're not bringing in families, so it has no effect on expense in that respect. But he also built in on the lower level grocery store over 6,000 square feet that would serve the purposes of the people of Phillipsburg. So this is an example of how positive ratables can come into the town where it can have a mixed use for the suburban areas, right? Suburban rural areas. We also utilize a property that was vacant for over 11 years, wasn't being used. So we weren't taking up new property to build this development either. We were redeveloping an old one that was just abandoned for 11 years. So we've given new life to this property, and it's now serving a new purpose, a positive purpose, and we'll be providing ratables as well. So I think, like I said, identify what your town needs. And I believe that the people of the town are the best people to sit down with your elected officials, with your planning board members, with your zoning members to discuss this. And then from there, try to bring developers that are truly committed to the prosperous future of your town. That's what I would say with that. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Mr. Councilman Clark. Next question. So this is similar, but quite different. And it kind of goes back to redevelopment and rehabilitation, more like redevelopment. So when it's a redevelopment plan and the developer is asking for a variance and an approval, what opportunities do the residents and the neighbors have to raise concerns about health and safety concerns in relation to the warehouse? And so these are situations, from my understanding, because I've had an opportunity to talk with different folks around the state about this, and this is not only happening in South Jersey but also other parts of the state as well. But what opportunities are there for residents to raise concerns about health and safety, being that that particular developer may be looking for a variance? And would that start with the zoning board, or would that go up to the plan? Like, kind of like, if you can kind of talk the arc that would take.
Yes. So usually these can come across the planning board. Now, as y'all know, variances can be denied. They can be approved by these entities, the boards themselves. I believe the best time to influence this or to bring up these concerns are at these public meetings, because they do hold these public meetings, as Tom has more elegantly put than I did in a technical sense, to share their input during open time. Because of these variances, it's an opportunity for the developer to try to fit into the zoning requirements for that land that they're trying to develop in, and thus would need a variant if needed to, what's the word I'm looking for, comply with the zoning requirements. So this would be a perfect opportunity for the public, members of the public, and even elected officials who may not necessarily agree with the project, if it be a warehouse looking for variances, to get involved, right? So I believe it's a coalition matter of influencing your public officials, whether they're appointed to the planning board, to the zoning board, trying to get it as early as possible before it comes to the governing board. Because by that point, it's already been approved that it's compliant with the master plan, right? And so it's harder then to combat it, and then it makes it more liable to lawsuits at that point. So getting it as early as possible by providing public input, I would say, would be the best way to address the issue.
Thank you for that. So I think this next question that kind of listening to what you've said so far, and I think that part of the challenge that local community members and residents have been facing is that a lot of times they're usually aware of a proposed warehouse development in their community, several months or, in some cases before they're aware of it. But in taking more of like a longer term and intermediate approach to engaging with local officials, both elected and unelected, and municipal leadership. How do you think that, everyday people can, what type of strategies or ways do you think that, residents can get involved, and what steps that they can take to be more engaged with folks like town council members or other, like what are some of the steps that folks can take on the ground and in their communities?
That's a great question, and I wanted to turn my video on for this. So if I lose you, I'm sorry, but I feel like my internet's stable enough now where I can see y'all and y'all can see me.
I'm gonna tell you.
So you're talking to.
Before you answer that, it's the energy that's been created over the course of the presentation. But go ahead.
Thanks.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt you.
So you're talking to a guy who cut his teeth in community organizing, right? So my job was to mobilize, organize folks to talk to their public officials. So I believe the best thing you can do first is attend your planning board meetings, attend your council meetings. Now I know this sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how little people come to these public meetings, and then they get surprised when this stuff happens. So it doesn't just happen out of the blue. It's the fact that people don't really go to their council or planning board meetings to begin with, and then they read about it in the news and they're like, what's going on? So I would say the first thing you need to do is go there. Talk to your representatives. If you have their email, and my email's on the town site, email them, ask them questions, share with them your concerns, because the problem with many folks is they wait till it's too late to get involved when all of the technical aspects were already taken care of. Everything that Tom, my colleague, talked about, usually all that's already done by the time people tend to get involved and choose to get involved. So you have to watch and attend and become knowledgeable about what's going on in your town. So with that being the first step, I would then say mobilize. Get your friends together, attend these meetings, share your concerns at these council meetings. Because I'm going to tell you right now, one thing that public officials do not like is being put on the spot. And I will share that with you. I don't mind sharing that with you, okay? It keeps us on our toes. It lets us know what our citizens, what our constituents are thinking, okay? And it also gets us out of that, okay, it's stagnant kind of thing. So draw up a conversation with your elected officials on the local level. And like I said, New Jersey is a home rule state. Many of these developments, many of these decisions are being made on the local level. Now, there are certain restrictions from the state because, as both I and Tom had said, towns are only empowered given what they're given through the MLUL. So it's not like we can just go off the boat here. But yeah, long answer short, I'm sorry I'm ranting on about this. Just have a conversation with your local officials and attend the meetings. I know they can be very boring and dry and very long, but you would be so surprised about the important aspects that we're discussing that affect everyone. That's why I decided to run, because as an organizer, I found that out. And so I decided to run so I can make a positive difference.
Thank you. So I have probably one or two more questions. I know you've taken several so far, and I just wanted to just highlight this one. That this one is very
Bring them
interesting.
on.
Yeah. So in reference to traffic, so whenever you have a warehouse that's established in a community, you have an increase in truck traffic, obviously, and the strain to the infrastructure of the roads and so forth, and anything associated with that. And so I think this question is more centered around zoning, and commercial versus light industrial.
Mhm.
And in some instances, they're somewhat lumped together. I don't know if you're familiar with that practice or not, and how that would have, in some cases, if a parcel or property is zoned as industrial or commercial, light industrial rather, or commercial, how that would affect a warehouse on that particular parcel.
So Tom would be able to answer this more technically than I can, but I'm going to take a bite at the apple with this one. So, I mean, if I understand the question, what's essentially the difference between a commercial zoning and a light industrial, and how does that affect the development of a potential warehouse?
Correct.
So, to my knowledge, and don't quote me on it, but to my knowledge, many warehouses have to be zoned as light industrial at a minimum. So, commercial, we're talking about office spaces, something like that. With something like a warehouse, there's more, there are more issues regarding it. So it has to be labeled light industrial in regards to that, because you're working with machinery, you can be working with chemicals. It's a number of aspects that you're just not going to cross with a commercial property, which, like I said, could be something like an office building and will not contribute nearly as much truck traffic as something that's light industrial, right? So that's one of the aspects that differentiates the two, right? So, and like I said, this is more of a question for Tom right here, but looking at it from a municipal elected official perspective, you wouldn't be able to get something massive, like a 500,000 square foot warehouse through a commercial zoning adaptation, right? That requires something a bit more arduous. So light industrial, heavy industrial, something like that. Once again, I don't want to give you any wrong information, but that is the most basic way I can explain it. Once again, if Tom was here, he could probably tell you the more technical lingo regarding it, but yes.
Thank you for that, Councilman Clark. So we have some other questions that are very highly technical here. But I wanted to thank both Tom and also Lee for taking the time to speak with us and present their point of views, and also providing us knowledge and information on tools that local community members can incorporate into their engagement and interaction with their local officials. Thank you, both of you, for coming. And before we finish and close out, I do have Catherine Fisher who wants to talk about a couple things moving forward.
All right. So once again, thank you everyone for coming, and just want to thank our speakers as well. Lee, you did a great job, and Tom also did a great job in laying out in more detail for these issues. And thank you everyone for coming. So this is clearly a pressing issue, and we want to empower you to take action in your own communities based on what you can learn from these webinars. So this is the second webinar in our warehouse series. So we thought of this topic because of popular demand. So we have a few other topics that we can consider for our next webinar. So I have some of these listed on the screen. So these are for fundraising, legal challenges, also organizing and advocacy, or any other topics that you can think of. So we're looking to have our third webinar probably in the next 6 to 8 weeks. So definitely keep a lookout on our Mobilize page on social media. But if you wanted to pop into the chat a suggestion that you would like to see in the next webinar, I'll give everybody about 1 minute, 2 minutes to put your suggestions, put your thoughts in the chat. before we close out for the night.
And just one more, thank you for that, Catherine. And just one more thing that I like to highlight as well. There will be the recording for this particular webinar will be available in the next several days. And also, if you did have any questions that were in the chat, when we do send out the information with the recording and also the follow-up email that we will be providing after that, we'll also be asking for any information in reference to any future webinars that anyone would like to see as well. And if there are any questions that weren't answered, please feel free to ask those questions, and we will find ways to provide insight and be able to answer those questions as well. So with that being said, thank you everyone for coming and attending. I hope that this was helpful and it was a resource for everyone that was in attendance. Enjoy your evening. Happy Thursday evening, and enjoy the rest of your night.